Hi, everybody. I'm Linda Solomon Wood. I'm founder and editor-in-chief of Canada's National Observer, and I'm here today with Bill McKibben. Bill is, in the words of Jane Mayer, one of the most far-sighted and gifted voices of our times. Bill, it's so great to have you here. Welcome back to Canada.
Well, it's always good to get to be even in virtual Canada, so thank you for having me.
So let's dive right in. This morning on Twitter, you wrote, Canada has a huge role to play in the future. Can you tell me a little bit about how you see that role?
Well, I mean, the climate crisis is the defining question of our century, the question that will determine what our world is like for everybody who comes after us. And the basic bottom line of climate change is how much carbon are we going to take out of the ground and put into the atmosphere? And Canada has a big role to play by virtue of, if nothing else, the fact that it has a lot of carbon in the ground. If it chooses to leave it there, then it will play a huge role in helping ward off the worst outcomes. If it decides, as it seems to have been committed to for years now, that it wants to dig up as much of it as possible and sell it to people to burn, then it makes the math of climate change much, much harder. Climate change is, in the end, a math problem. I mean, it has huge ideological, political, economic, social implications. The people who get hurt the first and hardest by it are those who did the least to cause it. We can talk, and I hope we will, about all the implications. But at root, it's the question is how much carbon is going to be in the atmosphere, and hence how much is the temperature going to go up? We've raised the temperature 1 degree centigrade so far. Canada has a front row seat to watch what happens when you do that. Basically, the Arctic melts. We're on a path to raise the temperature if we keep doing what we're doing at the moment. Even if we kept our Paris promises, the temperature would go up 3 degrees Celsius. If that happens, we won't be able to have civilizations like the ones we're used to. So that's why the fight is on.
Bill, you talk a lot in your books about the fact that the world when you were born, when I was born, is not the same world we're living in now. And you drive down really deeply into this concept of home. This is where we live. This is where we need to keep living. So how do you see where we are now in terms of home?
Well, you know, I wrote the first book about climate change back in 1989, so a long time ago. In my defense, I was only 27 or 28 at the time. So the we knew then more or less what was going to happen. Nothing really has shifted in the science in that whole time. We had fair warning, in other words, and we didn't do anything about it. The reason we didn't do anything about it, above all, is that the fossil fuel industry mounted a massive campaign to make sure that we didn't do anything about it. But as a result, we're now seeing those stories play out precisely as scientists said they would. And one way to think about it is the world that we inhabit, that humans can safely live on, is beginning to shrink and shrink pretty fast. So think about 2020. It was clearly the year of the coronavirus, but if it hadn't been that, it would have been the year of the conflagration. We saw fires like we've never seen before, from one end of the world to the other. I mean, those fires in Australia managed to kill, we think, 3 billion wild animals in the course of a couple of weeks. When fires reached the boreal forest of Siberia in midsummer, they burned in ways we've never seen before. In fact, some of those fires are still burning as we speak because they got into the peat underlying soils. You all saw what happened up and down the coast of California and Oregon last summer, fires like we've never seen before. BC was spared more or less this
year, but not previous
not
years.
compared to what we've been seeing. But by late autumn, the fires had moved to South America, and the Pantanal, the largest wetland on Earth, where Brazil and Argentina and Uruguay come together, about 25% of the largest wetland on Earth burned. So what does that tell you? Meanwhile, sea levels have begun inexorably to rise. Meanwhile, places are suffering from storms like we've never seen before. As you know, this was the worst hurricane season in Atlantic recorded history. We got deep into the Greek alphabet for storm names. And the last two storms, Eta and Iota, crashed into Central America. When they hit Honduras, they did damage, we think, equivalent to about 40% of the GDP of Honduras. By comparison, the worst storm that ever hit the US, Katrina, did damage equivalent to about 1% of our GDP. What I'm trying to say is there are lots of places in the world already that are getting difficult to live in. And people are begun to move, as a result. The UN estimates we might see 1 billion climate refugees this century if we can't
Wow.
get things under control soon. So try to imagine what that world looks like.
Right. Well, Bill, I want to bring you back to a couple of things about Canada. But before I do, I want to welcome everybody on the call. We had more than 1,000 people sign up to be on this call. And I see that David Suzuki is one of them. And I just want to do a special shout out to David. And but to
David,
all,
good to see you, old friend, if only virtually.
and I want to welcome everybody, because I know you're all busy and it's great to have you. And I know you're from all across Canada and probably all across North America. So welcome. Now I want to bring us back to Canada. So, Canada has a very aggressive climate plan, although at the same time, there's massive oil subsidies to oil and gas. So some people have called that Canada's hypocrisy problem. But today, Canada's government announced a $2.75 billion investment in electrified transit. So what do you make of, sort of the yin and yang of Canada's climate situation and policy?
I don't know everything about Canada's climate policy. In fact, the thing I mostly know about it was the very good article that Seth Klein wrote for the Observer, where he pointed out that Canada keeps saying, year after year that they have great climate policies, but they don't actually follow through very hard on them. And in fact, Canada's emissions continue to bump along at the same place year after year after year. So the proof of the pudding being in the tasting, even on that score, Canada has some work to do, along with a lot of other countries on Earth. The US is very much included. But the biggest problem, is that Canada so far can't seem to come to terms with the fact that it needs to leave carbon in the ground. A couple of years ago, Mr. Trudeau went down to speak at a big conference, oil and gas conference in Texas. And he said to them, no country would leave, and I think it was 73 billion barrels of oil or something, 73 trillion barrels of oil, some oil in the ground. And they all cheered and no, nobody would do that. Well, people went and did the math, and when you did the math, it turned out that if Canada burned the amount of oil that the Prime Minister had said it would not leave in the ground, that would use up about 30% of the planet's remaining carbon budget. Canada's less than 1% of the world's population. That's not okay. Canada, it's interesting. The other country that in population and in educational profile and in policy is too much like Canada is Australia, which also has big carbon reserves and has been unwilling to leave them in the ground. That's why, of course, one of the reasons that people have worked hard against things like the Keystone pipeline or other tar sands pipelines in an effort to try and strand some of that carbon in the ground, just in the same way that we've worked hard against pipelines in the US or in East Africa or in Europe or on and on and on. It's simply because you can't make the math work if we keep doing this stuff.
Have you ever had a chance to talk to Trudeau about this?
No, I never have. I've never, it's funny because, you know, you may not know this. When I was a young boy, I lived in Toronto. Um,
Wow. No,
my
I didn't
father
know
was
that.
a, my father was a journalist in Canada. He covered Canada for Business Week magazine. And
Mhm.
so when I went to grade 1 through 5 in Toronto, Northleigh Public School, where in fact I was 1 year behind a boy named Stephen Harper. Um,
Ah,
um, so I think I may have talked on the playground to Stephen Harper, but Pierre Elliott Trudeau was an important name in our household growing up. My first political memories were him and Jean Drapeau and René Lévesque and all these sort of Canadians. And so I followed uh, young Mr. Trudeau's career with great interest, but I've never talked to him. I don't think that, I mean, I think the sad part here is that he hasn't grasped the real opportunity to kind of lead on change. He's let himself, it feels like from a distance, he's let himself be led by the fossil fuel industry instead of sort of grasping the opportunity for real change.
that is fascinating. So before I move on to my question, which is, so you're framing this as an opportunity for Trudeau, and I'm really curious to hear you speak more about that. Before we go there, I also want to welcome the Honorable Elizabeth May, who's on the call, and just acknowledge her. Elizabeth also gave me some great ideas about questions today. So welcome to her. And I want to say to everybody on the call, if you don't know it already, we have a very lively chat going, and I encourage all of you to join because our team is dropping in links there to the topics we're talking about. So tell us, like, if you could sit down with Justin Trudeau, what would you say to him?
Well, I think that at this point, what one would say to him is, look at what's happening now south of the border. The Biden administration actually seems really serious about starting to get things done. They've put John Kerry in charge of global climate diplomacy. And his first day in office, he said, we've got to stop building new stuff, new fossil fuel infrastructure, because we're going to have to abandon it in 10 or 20 years. That's just how it works. And I think, I mean, it's not that the story is complicated here. It's difficult because of vested interest, but the basic story isn't complicated. We can't keep burning things. That's the basic rule of physics and chemistry about climate change. If we burn things and we put carbon in the atmosphere, the temperature heats up and everything goes, if not to hell, then to a place with a roughly similar temperature. Okay, we can't burn things, and we shouldn't therefore build especially anything new that eventually connects to a flame. So no new pipelines to take stuff. I mean, we've got to be winding down these industries, not expanding them. And
So what would you say
so,
to Mr. Trudeau?
so what I'd say is, you're a lucky guy. You happen to be in power in the moment when the engineers have given you an extraordinary gift. In the last 10 years, the price of solar power and wind power fell 90%, an order of magnitude. It's now the cheapest way to produce energy across most of the world. Canada's blessed with sun and a lot of wind. Um, it has extraordinary possibilities to start doing things that will put lots of people to work. I just did a piece for the New Yorker about North Dakota, just south of the border, and about the way that people have begun to take oil field workers and train them to be wind turbine technicians. The skill sets cross nicely. The jobs are not as rough on your body, and they're not subject to the same kind of boom bust cycles that govern the oil patch. Um, um, and 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 you can spend a lifetime therefore at them,
Yeah.
and they don't leave behind. I mean, think about what Canada's dealing with now. I mean, as I remember, last numbers I saw, there's hundreds of billions of dollars already in abandoned oil wells that are
Yeah.
someone's going to have to somehow go and well, that better, I mean, the people who built them are probably the ones best suited to go and help cap them and take care of them. So, that
Some
idea.
of them are small wildcat, small
Yeah.
operators that have abandoned them long
And
ago. And
aren't planning to pay for the
no,
privilege
they're
of
on to
cleaning them
the
up, I
next
don't think.
chapter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Someone else's problem.
But I just wanted to say that Elizabeth May said, we absolutely can deliver real climate actions. The provinces are not the barrier. The absence of political will is the problem. So again, back to our Liberal government that, I feel like they've done quite a lot in investing in the future of clean energy, and, they're making strides. So how would you give Justin Trudeau that?
Yeah, in my worldview, sitting down with the guys who are nominally in charge of things is rarely the way that you make change happen.
Mm.
Change happens when people build movements that change the zeitgeist, that change people's sense of what's normal and natural and obvious. And once you do that, then politicians can move into that space and implement things. We labor under the idea that our political leaders are leaders, and that's rarely, I think, the case. They perform important roles, but those roles are mostly about occupying space that people have cleared for them. So, I mean, my interest always is not in sitting down behind closed doors with leaders. My interest is always in helping build movements that change what's possible. And there's a lot of that going on in Canada. Look, the most important players in a lot of ways, from my point of view, the people who got me going on a lot of this work years ago, are First Nations leaders across Canada. And so I think of, people like Melina Lubacan Massimo, or Clayton Thomas Muller, or Reuben George, or, just remarkable people who started bringing these questions up 10, 15, 20 years ago. Questions about sovereignty, but also questions about carbon and how they all link together.
And public health. They all brought up the issue of public health as well.
Absolutely. And that's an issue that, we now understand in much greater detail. Let's pretend for a minute that burning fossil fuel wasn't destroying the climate of the planet. It clearly is, but let's pretend for a minute that it isn't. We had a report last week from a big series of new studies demonstrating that around the world, particulates from fossil fuel emissions kill 8.7 million people a year, one death in 5 in the world, bigger than HIV, AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis combined. And we don't need to be doing it anymore because, thankfully, the good Lord installed a large flame 93 million miles away at a nice safe distance. And we have the brain power now to take solar panels and capture that sunlight and turn it into power. And we can build wind turbines and take the differential heat that sun creates, and hence the wind that it produces, and capture that too. Those are remarkable gifts, and we're capable of using them now.
It's so interesting, the New Yorker article that you just mentioned that you wrote about, the just transition, new jobs. And what you're talking about now about, the infrastructure that's already there, but we aren't using it. And it seems like so many people have, in Canada at least, have a hard time believing that we really could make that transition from, oil workers in Alberta transitioning to workers in an industry that is, solar and wind powered energy. So what do you say to that? Because that's really a failure of imagination. Is that a failure of the media? Like how do you?
It's a bias towards the status quo. And we all have that. Like, the world as it exists right now seems obvious and normative to us, and it's hard to imagine it being different. But increasingly, there are examples all over the world that make it clear just how fast change can happen and how much can be done. I mean, we're now building, off the coast of Europe, we're building wind farms in the course of 18 months that are the equivalent of, many big coal-fired or nuclear power stations, massive solar installations going in large, in India, in China at remarkable rates. Some of that status quo bias, of course, comes from the fact that there are people making money out of the current way of doing things who don't want to surrender that. And I was very taken by a report this week that my friend Richard Brooks at Stand helped put out, pointing out the role of RBC, of the bank, in, as a just absolute prime fossil fuel lender. People still trying to make money off, really make money off the end of the world.
Well, let's talk about that industry a little bit more. So last week on Twitter, you said the only goal of oil companies is to extend their business model another decade or two. And if they succeed, they will break the planet. And then today, I read that the American Petroleum Institute may actually come out in favor of carbon taxes.
Right.
So what are these two competing forces we're seeing?
Well, they're very much the same force, I think. So here's how the world plays out at the moment. Overt climate denial is kind of over, I think. It got on the plane with Donald Trump and flew off to Mar-a-Lago, and I doubt it's coming back. I don't see any percentage left for almost anybody anymore in just pretending that nothing's happened. So now the question becomes, if you're an oil company and you spent 30 years investing in basically in climate denial, but that jig is up now. So now what do you do? And so now what we're seeing are all these plans for what are essentially climate delay, climate sloth, to slow walk this thing in an effort to keep business as usual going, as much of it as possible, as long as possible. They're smart enough to know it's not going to go forever. I mean, 75 years from now, we're obviously going to run the planet on sun and wind because it's free. Why would anyone keep trying to, think about the tar sands, think about the unbelievable effort it takes to liberate this stuff from the sand and put it in pipes and send it to refineries and, run it through cars. And, when you can, I've got solar panels on my roof and they connect with a wire to the electric car in the garage, and that's that. So clearly 75 years from now we'll have made this transition, but if it takes anything like 75 years, even if it takes 25 years, we're going to break the planet. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the governing authority here, the scientific body, and their last report came out in October of 2018. And what it said was that if we hadn't made fundamental transformations of our energy system by 2030, and they helpfully defined fundamental transformations as cutting emissions in half, then we would not be able to meet the targets that we set just 6 years ago in Paris. They would go by the board. That means we got an extensive amount of work to do over the next 10 years, on the bleeding edge of the technically possible, but the stakes are enormously high. If we don't do it, then we are going to have to try and inhabit a world that's basically uninhabitable. If we do it, then the work will produce all kinds of excellent payoffs along the way. I'm thinking of your fellow British Columbians, Naomi Klein and Avi Lewis, and the amazing couple of videos that they put together over the last year, kind of the message from the future, sort of imagining what the world looks like if we actually do this work of making this transition. And what do you know? We have democratized energy. We have lots and lots and lots more jobs, and those jobs are much safer and cleaner and less prone to boom and bust. We move into a different kind of future. We're going to go to that future. If we go there slowly, then it's going to be horrible. If we go there quickly, it's almost like ripping a Band-Aid off. Let's just do it, get it done.
Bill, thank you for that. I'm noticing that people are saying in the chat that they're having difficulty hearing you. Do you think maybe you could
Let
come
me
closer
shout
to?
a little louder.
There you go. Okay. Great. So let's turn, like everything you're saying, we have 10 years, we have these enormous challenges. We have, the oil and gas industries fighting to still make profits at the end of the world. Now let's turn to that big buzzword, net zero.
Mm.
Because on along the way, as we try to get to that word net zero, there's going to be a lot of obfuscation around it. Bloomberg Green wrote this week that without more concrete near-term actions, net zero risks becoming a fairy tale, providing cover for the heavy emitting industries, particularly those in the fossil fuel sector who have aggressively blocked climate action. So, Bill, is net zero a fairy tale?
Well, so the first thing to say is when people say net zero by 2050, the first problem with it is 2050. 2050 yeah. is not a very interesting year. 2030 is an interesting year. That's what the scientists have told us. That's when we've got to do most of the work to break the back of this problem. So that means doing big things right now. 2050 is comforting if you're a CEO or a politician, because what are the odds you're going to
be out there?
You know,
in our grandchildren's time.
Exactly, someone else's. Although it must be said that it's coming faster than it's not that far away. But in political and quarter by quarter business terms, it's far enough away to seem comforting to CEOs. Second thing is this sort of net zero can turn into this elaborate accounting thing where you start saying, oh, we're going to plant a bunch of trees, or we're going to come up with, at the moment, notional technology to suck carbon out of the atmosphere once we've put it there. Mostly they seem to be ways to allow us to continue what we're doing now, and have a kind of out. You remember how, you remember reading about how in the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church was happy to sell you indulgences, that would allow you to get out of purgatory. You could, take care of your sins. Well, I mean, I'm not a theologian, so maybe it works in purgatory, but it doesn't work in physics.
It's a great analogy. Can we turn to Mark Carney, the former head of the Bank of Canada? Last week, he's now on the board of Brookfield Assets, one of the biggest Canadian-owned energy companies. And last week, Carney made the announcement that Brookfield Assets was net zero. And there was huge pushback by climate advocates who said Brookfield Assets was equating avoided emissions with removed emissions. And Carney had to do a big walk back. Does pressure like this have wider impacts?
Well, first of all, can I just say something? I truly admire Mark Carney, and I think he's done an enormous amount of really useful work. His decision when he was running whatever it's called, governor of the Bank of England, or
yes,
whatever,
governor of Bank of Canada,
to tell in England to tell people that they had to tell banks and insurance companies that they had to start accounting for their carbon risk was one of the real turning points over the last 10 years.
He said, can you just unpack that a little bit for us?
He said, if you're a bank or an insurance company, you have to start taking into account the fact that this stuff you own is risky. You're holding on to, for instance, stranded assets, because if you're telling everybody that you've got a solid balance sheet, but it rests, say, on the idea that you're going to take oil sands out of Alberta, well, you're probably not going to be able to do that, because the world's not going to stand for that. We can't do it. So when he started sending that signal, it was really important in the financial community. And this movement of the financial community couldn't be more important. So I'm glad that he walked back his overambitious claims about all this, because it really is important to get the accounting right. Everybody, I mean, look, I mean, it's human nature to try and keep doing what you're doing, or as much of it as you can, as long as you can. That's why it's hard to go on diets or quit smoking or, anything else. And, it's, if you're a bank or an asset manager or whatever, it's easier to basically try and keep exactly the same business you've got going. But these guys actually need to change right away. In a weird way, I have more sympathy, a little more sympathy for the Exxons of the world, because they only know how to do one thing. If you're Exxon, the only thing you know how to do is dig stuff up and burn it. That's it. That's your entire skill set. If you're RBC or Chase Bank or Citi or Bank of America, yeah, you make some money off fossil fuels, but it's what, 5, 6, 7% of your deal book.
Yeah.
You know how to do lots of things. There's lots of people to lend money to. You could just say, since we're facing the end of the world, perhaps we'll take this part of our business and shut it down, because it.
But I understand if you were watching the Super Bowl, you would think that Exxon or the oil companies were spending all their time working on renewable energy projects.
Exxon is an algae company that just happens to have a couple of oil wells on the side.
Right. Can we move to talking about using trees to achieve net zero? So Bloomberg did this great investigative piece about Nature Conservancy. And as you know, they're the world's largest environmental group, and they've developed carbon offset projects that generate millions of dollars in revenue by preserving forests that apparently aren't really actually in danger of being harvested. One of those Nature Conservancy projects happens to be in BC. It's the Dark Woods Forest. But so these offsets are bought by groups as broad as the BC government and many other, Shell Oil Canada, and some say that this is just an example of the allure of using climate funds to achieve other aims, and that environmental NGOs are becoming addicted to these dollars as a way to fund other values. So what I want to ask you is, other forests are really endangered. How do we make this equation add up?
Yeah, I don't know what the story is with environmental NGOs in Canada and offsets and things. I mean, the basic rules are, one, we shouldn't be cutting down forests. The more we understand about how forests work, the more we understand that especially old forests sequester huge amounts of carbon. There's been a lot of data on this, even in the last 6 months. And if you Google, the term of art that people are starting to emerge with is proforestation. It turns out that even better than planting new forests is protecting existing ones from being cut down.
Right.
Now, of course, if it's not going to be cut down anyway, then it doesn't help you any. But the real point is, we should be preserving forests because we desperately need them. We should be planting trees where it makes sense to do it. But none of that has anything to do with the fact that we need to stop burning coal and gas and oil. There's already way too much carbon in the atmosphere. This is not some prospective problem. I mean, the thing that we started was called 350.org because 350 parts per million is the most carbon the scientists say we can safely have in the atmosphere. We're at 400, and I think as of today, the Mauna Loa monitor was reading 418 parts per million CO2. That's not okay. I mean, that's way too much. We've got to stop putting more in, and we've got to do it right now.
Okay, Bill, there are a lot of questions in the chat about nuclear energy and what your views are on that. Could you tell us where you stand on that?
Sure. So nuclear energy is interesting, and useful in that you produce relatively small amounts of carbon as you use it. So in that way, it's useful. Everybody knows what the dangers that come with it are, in terms of waste and in terms of, what happens if something goes wrong. Those are not, it seems to me, dispositive dangers. That is, yes, if something goes wrong at a nuclear power plant, it can go really, really wrong, and that'll be really bad. If you run a gas-fired power plant exactly according to spec, it destroys the world. So, that's worth remembering. At least in an American context, and I think in much of the world, the deeper question for nuclear power at the moment has to do with the fact that it's pretty expensive. Um, the price of solar panels and wind has gone down, 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 down the last decade. The price of nuclear power in most places keeps going up, 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 partly because it's very tied to the old way of doing things, these highly centralized, hugely capitalized, very slow to build um, 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 facilities. Uh, in a world where we're increasingly thinking of power as a commodity that we can produce and consume on a kind of very spread out, decentralized basis. So my guess is that nuclear is going to play a relatively small part going forward in the solution to this. In the context of the states, I think people should be careful probably about shutting down existing nuclear power plants that we've paid for and that are producing relatively low carbon energy. If there are any ways to, if spending a lot of money upgrading them often becomes a financial drag of its own. But ones that are operating with relative safety at the moment, it strikes me as smart to try and keep them going.
In Canada, we have, particularly around Ontario, an aging nuclear power plant, and, there's concern in Ontario about that plant. Do you think that kind of infrastructure should be revitalized, or do you think
I think
replace it with gas, with solar and wind?
I think in general, what people are going to find is it's a lot cheaper to do renewable energy than not. Remember that nuclear reactor 93 million miles away. Um,
Yeah.
You know, we've got to be taking clever advantage of the things that that we've been given.
I think you're referring to the sun.
The sun, yes.
Okay. Bill, my next question is going to be about Keystone XL. But
Yes.
first, I just want to say again to those of you who are just jumping on the call, my name is Linda Solomon Wood. I'm editor-in-chief of Canada's National Observer, and I'm speaking with Bill McKibben, the founder of 350.org and an acclaimed leader in the fight to keep our planet healthy. I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in today. We're not done. We still have half an hour left. But I want to say that National Observer is a member of the Trust Project and also of Mother Jones's Climate Desk. Every day, we bring Canada the best of fact-based climate journalism from here and around the world, and hard-hitting investigations on Canada, plus analysis you won't get anywhere else. And as a gift for those of you,
I read it, and I read particularly. I was saying earlier, but it's fun to read Seth Klein, whose book about kind of wartime mobilization to deal with climate change, parts of which he's talked about in your pages, is one of the most important things anyone's written about this in a long time.
It's fantastic. And we also have the singular climate columnist Barry Saxifrage and many others. And I just wanted to encourage you to subscribe today and to tell you, as a special gift for those of you here who aren't subscribed, we're offering a promo code in our chat. And when you subscribe today, you're not only joining our community of tens of thousands of climate advocates, citizens, and policymakers, but you are proactively fighting against climate disinformation. So just go to nationalobserver.com, subscribe, and type in #McKibben. So now on to something National Observer has covered extensively. And Bill, you've been involved in for a long time, pipelines. So as I was mentioning to you before we got on, I've spent the last week immersed in your writing. And I learned that, I knew that you had opposed Keystone XL, but I didn't realize that you really started that movement to oppose Keystone XL. And you've even gone to jail for acts of civil disobedience.
Well, let me just say, I didn't really start. I mean, First Nations people in Canada, really,
right,
referencing Melina Lubicon Massimo, who told me, was the first person to really tell me about what was going up in the tar sands. What I did was help bring, what had been a kind of regional battle in the tar sands and in the parts of America, mostly Nebraska, this pipeline was going through. Some of us worked to build it out into a sort of first big moment for the climate movement 10 or 12 years ago.
Thank you for clarifying that, because yes. But I did want to mention that how vividly you describe your going to jail in Oil and Honey, and how it really wasn't just, it actually was a really big deal. But it also is a turning point. So Biden has stopped the Keystone Pipeline construction, but so did Obama. And then came Trump.
It's not
now.
coming.
Okay. Okay. But now oil companies are stepping up rail shipments for Canada's crude oil. I hate to
disappoint Mr. Kenny, but there's no way the Keystone Pipeline's getting built. In fact, he and Trudeau should have been able to, the fact that they thought there was some way they were going to persuade Joe Biden about this, I'm afraid indicates a certain naivete about American politics. Joe Biden came out against the Keystone Pipeline before Barack Obama did, a decade ago. There was no way. The real question is whether we can manage to persuade him to use the same logic to stop Line 3, where big battle's underway right now. And
is that into Minnesota? Is that one? Yeah.
Yep. Mm-hmm. And it's a huge fight right now.
And it's going through waterways, and can you just
going through waterway. But the thing to always remember about this stuff is, A, if it spills, it's a disaster. B, if it doesn't spill, it's a disaster, because then it gets to a refinery and you burn it and it spills into the atmosphere and destroys the climate, which is the biggest problem human beings have ever faced. QED, it's all just a bad idea.
I was kind of disheartened, though, to see last week that I read that the oil companies are just stepping up rail transportation.
Yeah, there'll be some of that, and they keep saying they're going to do it, but it never really happens in anything like. The reason they want to build pipelines is because they're endlessly cheaper than doing it by train. So the volume that was coming out by train from the. Remember when we started the fight against the Keystone Pipeline, the plan in Alberta was to quadruple production out of the tar sands. And there were plans for all kinds of pipelines and this, no one's talking about that now. It's become very clear that there's massive resistance, and not just in America, obviously. Canadians are, in America, at least the pipelines we were fighting were, private corporations were trying to build, TransCanada, Enbridge, whatever. In Canada, you've taken this to a whole new art and decided that it would be a good idea to literally put the taxpayer on the hook for building the pipelines. And those fights are going, it's gonna be hard to finish Trans Mountain. Did you see this week that I think the federal government is trying to persuade some other part of the federal government that it doesn't need to even tell people who the insurance companies for TMF are, because they know that activists have been pressuring insurance companies hard not to do this. Because think about it for a minute, insurance companies, who are the people we ask in our system to understand risk, have every bit of data there is about climate change in the whole world. They're the last people on earth that should be therefore trying to make a little money on the side by insuring things that will make all that data all the much worse.
Bill, we could talk about pipelines for like 3 hours, and I wish that we had that time. And I hope you'll come back and talk with us again about all of this. I want to just move quickly to 350.org's efforts around divestment.
Mm.
And, you've built a movement on college campuses. To date, what do you think the total dollar figure is that's been diverted from fossil fuels as a result of your
Well,
campaigns?
I'll give you my best estimate of the money, but let me just say first, because she's there in British Columbia. Um, the person who kind of dreamed up the divestment stuff with me was Naomi Klein. And both of us were thinking back to our school days when there was a huge divestment fight over apartheid in South Africa.
Yeah.
And one of the first people we asked about this one was Desmond Tutu, the Anglican Archbishop of South Africa, who'd been crucial in that fight. And he said, yeah, do it again, because climate change is the human rights question of our time. So we started. We did not expect it would grow to become what I think is arguably the largest anti-corporate campaign ever. We're at $15 trillion now in endowments and portfolios that have divested in part or in whole.
$15 trillion
Yeah,
have
and they're
taken off the side.
They're huge funds that are now, the New York City and New York State pension funds. That's $500 billion right there. The University of California system, there's $100 billion. The Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, there's $1 trillion right there. Most of it made in North Sea oil, but they're smart enough to know where the future lies. One of the ironies of all of this is that, probably Naomi and I are not the first people in the world you would turn to for investment advice. It's not really our specialty in the world. But as it turns out, we were very prescient about all this. People who started divesting made out like bandits because the fossil fuel sector has been the worst performing part of the economy for the last 10 years. No big surprise, since on the one hand, their product is destroying the planet, and of course, therefore, there's regulatory pressure. And on the other hand, engineers are figuring out how to do the same thing, generate energy, just cheaper and cleaner from sun and wind. So
Yeah.
it's no wonder now, and every day now somebody else joins in. I mean, in the last year, it's Oxford and Cambridge and Edinburgh and, university.
So you're seeing them join in, and are you seeing a ripple effect among just, like the regular investor? Has it affected investor sentiment?
It's harder to measure exactly because, most people don't put out press releases when they, change their personal investment strategy. But here's what we know. In America, our favorite stock picker who goes on TV every night is a guy named Jim Cramer. If you watch CNBC, he yells at you every night about what to buy and not. And he devoted 2 programs last January just telling everybody, don't buy oil stock anymore. You can't make money in it because so many funds are divested and aren't allowed to own it that it's a dog of a investment now. Shell Oil said last year in their annual report that divestment had become a material risk to their business, which is good because their business is a material risk to life on planet Earth, So this divestment thing is now morphing into this serious questioning of not just the fossil fuel industry, but the financial industry that supports it. Hence that important work on RBC that Stand has done this week. Hence this Stop the Money pipeline campaign that everybody is now deeply involved in, and standing up to the big banks and asset managers and beginning to make some real progress.
That's so impressive, Bill. And we have a question from a 15-year-old. His name is James Doyle, and he wants to know, how does my generation stop the need for greed? I'm 15 and I'm going to fight.
Well, the question is not what 15-year-olds need to be doing, because they're doing it. I mean, look, young people are the absolute heart of this fight now. Everybody knows Greta Thunberg, and they should. Greta is great. I adore her. She's one of my favorite people in the world to work with. She's an innovator in in nonviolent action in the same way that Gandhi and King and people were in the last. She's just smart. And there are 10,000 Greta Thunbergs scattered around the planet, and there are 10 million young people following them, and that's remarkable. So James P., you know, your generation is doing what needs doing. I think the real question is, how do we make sure that the generation I'm actually most interested in right now and beginning to try and do serious work around organizing is actually old people. Because so much political power, because everybody votes, and so much economic power, because that's who ended up with most of the money, out of the prosperity of the last decades, resides in those groups, that it's going to be really important for people as they age to start taking the legacy that they're leaving behind seriously. And the legacy we're leaving behind at the moment is not a good legacy. We're the first generations on this planet who are going to leave the world a worse place than we found it. That's not okay. And so, I mean, I think the real answer, James, is keep shouting out so that your grandparents have to answer, so that they understand just how much you want them to be taking the steps that at this point they can take to follow the lead of young people. It's a real opportunity right now.
Bill, you're a journalist yourself. You started your career writing talk of the towns for the New Yorker, which I thought was so interesting. Tell me, what do you think is the biggest challenge right now for climate journalists? And where are the biggest opportunities for far-reaching impact?
Well, it's a golden age of climate journalism. I must say, nothing makes me happier, because I can remember a very different age. There was a long period of time in the 90s and early aughts, in America anyway, when if there was a significant story on climate someplace, there was like a roughly 70% chance that I'd written it, which was terrible. I mean, it's ridiculous. And it was very lonely. I hated the feeling of, I felt like, when you're in one of those dreams where you can see some monster coming and you can't get anybody else to see it and pay attention to it. Now we have thousands of great climate journalists, and they're doing remarkable work. And some of them are very mainstream places. Bloomberg is doing a great job. The New York Times is doing a fantastic job. The Washington Post is doing a great job. The Financial Times and The Economist are providing really profound coverage around climate. And so much of it now is being driven by the fact that there are big economic forces at play. And so business journalists and economic journalists are covering this in new ways. I think that the real openings remain, the real holes remain around helping people imagine what that transition is going to look like and how possible it is. That's why I was referencing those videos that the Leap group had been making about imagining the future, because they do a good job of helping start to let people see. I used the word before, zeitgeist, because I think it's the most important word in this whole question. I think that once you've won the battle of the zeitgeist, then the legislative part and things begin to follow. And so I think that journalism and writing in general, or communicating in general, that allows us to see that world is so important. It's one of the reasons I was really happy. I got in the mail today Naomi's new book, which is a version of This Changes Everything aimed at middle school students. It was terrific. It's also why I think it's so important that we have lots of good literary writers, novelists taking up this question. If I can recommend two books, one, I'm sure by now most people have read Richard Powers' and The Overstory, which is remarkable book. And another book that I think is really important is Kim Stanley Robinson's book, Ministry for the Future. He's probably the most important science fiction writer in the world right now, or one of them. That's too broad. There's other great science fiction writers, but he's writing his science fiction, has concentrated on dealing with the climate crisis, and it's really, really worth reading precisely for this reason of allowing one to imagine things in a different way.
Bill, you've been at this a long time now. You've been like, as you said, you were a young man in your mid-20s when you wrote that international bestseller that, really put this on the radar in popular consciousness. And so much has happened over, the last decades. And I just wonder, looking back, what's your view of humanity's ability to really face this and move forward? We know it's so urgent.
Well, I mean, it's a test. It's a test of whether the big brain was a good evolutionary idea or not. It clearly can get us in a lot of trouble. And now we're going to find out if it can get us out. And my suspicion is that the big brain will be important in getting us out, but the real question will be how big the hearts to which it is attached are. That is, can we understand a new ethic of solidarity in this world? Can we understand that this is an opportunity to turn our back on a kind of what James, your 15-year-old, was describing as a kind of greed-based economy, and understand it as an impossible time that we can take up a kind of care-based economy? Can we make those transitions? I think we can. I think that human beings are capable of it. I worry whether we can do it in the time that we have allotted. It's the reason that I get so crazily mad at the Exxons of the world, because their campaigns of deception and disinformation cost us 3 decades. And now we have to jam into 1 decade the work of 4. And it's going to be extraordinarily hard. It's why I'm so glad that we have leaders everywhere. David Suzuki and Elizabeth May are good examples. I don't know that much about Canadian politics, but I do know that every Canadian election, I stay up late just to make sure that the good people of the islands there return Elizabeth May back to Ottawa, because I've been watching her and enjoying her work for a very long time. It's a good thing that we have some leaders like that. But what's really good is that it's now translated into these big, broad, massive movements. My mistake as a young journalist, Linda, was in thinking that we were mostly engaged in an argument, and that if we just kept piling up more reports and books and articles and things, eventually the powers that be would do the right thing. It took me too long to figure out that we were engaged not in an argument, but in a fight. And that the fight was not about data and reason, it was about what fights are always about: money and power. Okay. And that therefore we would have to mobilize. We're never going to have the money that Exxon has, or that TransCanada has, or that Enbridge has, or anything else. We were going to have to build power the only other way you can, by getting lots of people together and seeing what happened. And what's happened is that now that power has begun to balance some. And that's why we're able to at least take this on. So, being a creature of habit, I would say a good recipe for the coming 10 years would be to do a lot more movement building and keep up that kind of power building, and see what we can make happen and how fast we can make it happen.
Thank you, Bill. I wanted to also let you know that Avi Lewis is listening in right now, and I'm sure would like to say hello. And that we also have a Vancouver City Councillor. So, hopefully some of what you're saying today is going to ripple out in not only federal policy, but municipal and provincial policy too.
Well, it's a great pleasure to get to be in virtual Canada, virtual British Columbia, and I
Mhm.
look forward to when we're all vaccinated and getting back to the real thing, because there's very few places in the world that are as beautiful, and very few places in the world with as many people fighting the good fight. So many, many thanks to you all. Know that you have brothers and sisters in this work all over the world, and know that they're paying attention to what you're doing, and are proud of you for doing it.
Bill, thank you so much. And for those of you listening in, I hope you're going to join me next week when I'll be talking with Julian Brave Noisecat. Julian's a part of the golden age of climate journalism that Bill was talking about. And Bill actually introduces him and his work recently in Time Magazine's next 2021 list of emerging leaders. If you like what we do and you'd like to help us do more, subscribe, purchase an annual subscription, and all that marketing stuff that I don't like telling you, but I have to. It's $56 tonight instead of $139.99. Tonight's episode with Bill was produced by Youre at the Tajvidi at the Canadian Center for Journalism. Thank you so much for your amazing work on this, Youre. And I'd also like to thank the following people for contributing tonight on questions and context. Thank you, Sandy Garasino, Carrie and Barry Saxifrage, the Honorable Elizabeth May, and a big shout out to my friends and colleagues, Janelle Johnson and Jenny Uechi, who are always there in so many remarkable ways. And last but not least, to the amazing Andy Wright for general inspiration and for encouraging me to keep developing these conversations. Good night, everyone. Have a great evening.
Take care.